Welcome back to another session of No Suits, No Slides. John Frehse and I have done a couple of these sessions, and we're thrilled to now be joined by Shawn Miles and Tom Crawford as well. Also senior managing directors at Ankura Group. Tom, Shawn, you want to just introduce yourselves real quickly, and John as well?
Hi, I'm Tom Crawford. I'm the Chief Development Officer at Ankura, and I am also leading the global advisory practice around a lot of the issues we'll talk about today.
And I'm Shawn Miles. I'm a Senior Managing Director in the Global Strategies and Solutions Group, focused on public policy and ESG.
And I'm John Frehse again, and I run our global labor strategy practice.
So John and I have talked a number of times now about all of the different trends going on now in the labor market and the job recovery. What we're going to focus on in these next couple conversations is ESG. If you guys can just introduce the topic, what is ESG?
And before they do, why don't you tell us who you are, Dave Gilbertson?
Sure. All right, Dave Gilbertson, Vice President at UKG. We're a software company in the human capital management space and looking at these issues all the time, so actively participating in the conversation.
Great. Well, ESG, everybody knows the buzzwords of environment, social, and governance, but really, what is that and why is it such a big issue? I think that what's happened recently, given all of the societal dynamics that we see both here and around the world, people are not waiting anymore for governments to regulate, for policies to get enacted, to do the right thing. And activists have figured out that by organizing consumers, voters, putting pressure on policymakers, boards of directors, reputation of companies, they can affect change. And I think the other thing that's really interesting is investors have followed suit. Companies now are being rated on how well they do ESG, sustainability, by things like ISS. When we're looking at how do you support boards of directors or corporate policies, all of a sudden these issues are very much in the mix. The last thing I think that's interesting to me is that activists have gotten much more pragmatic. They used to play a zero-sum game on issues, and now more and more they're getting compromise and change by creating pressure and negotiating directly with C-suites and boards. And I think this opens up a whole new opportunity for companies that they should be thinking about. These aren't burn your house down, activities. These are make the world better, improve society, get freedom to operate if you can show societal value.
Yeah, Tom, it's the focus on ESG, well, the term itself is really a corporate buzzword, and it really is tied within corporate structures. When I talk to community leaders and others, they have no idea what that term is, nor are they familiar with it. But what it really is about, as you mentioned, in a fundamental way, is how are you as a company showing up in society, and what is your societal promise around these particular areas of environmental, social, and governance. And this is something that companies, until recently, hadn't had to face in this very strategic way. And now they're being evaluated not only by watchdog groups, but investors and policymakers on how they operate in terms of how they show up in society. And that is sort of revolutionary because I, as a company, was just here to make widgets or sell services, and now you're asking me to be more than that. So I think that's kind of where we are with ESG.
It seems like that world has changed a lot over the past few years, right? 5 years ago, companies would maybe do a fundraiser for a local nonprofit, but that's about it. So Shawn, what changed? Why is this top of mind all of a sudden, not just with companies, but all the way up to the C-suite across the country?
Well, certainly the environmental issues in terms of the amount of attention that they receive and the importance of our environment and making sure we have a clean environment, started to gain a lot of traction over the years. I would say, from the governance perspective, what happened with the financial crisis and seeing some of those companies collapse and not having great governance, probably even going back to, Sarbanes-Oxley and the like, there's been this focus on, companies really have to make sound and be somewhat measured in types of risk that they're willing to take. And then the social issues, I think probably 5 to 6 years ago, companies were now starting to face some pressures either from their consumers, customers, or employees, or others to take positions on issues that they normally would not have had to take positions on.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I also think that this is a global phenomenon. So you've got places like Europe where a lot of U.S. companies are operating, for example, going to the circular economy or, gender equality in pay, leading the way on climate change. And that's caused an awareness, I think, globally that, there's a bigger responsibility and others are doing it. So it's not a question of can you do it. You've got, the sort of investor activism around seeing more diversity and inclusion. And by the way, as you get more diversity and inclusion in C-suites and on boards, you're seeing a bigger sensitivity to these societal issues where groups have not been, historically considered or been part of the planning. And I think, from a profit, motivation point of view, we're finding new markets, we're accessing new communities, we're including, new populations of people. And at the end of the day, that's good business.
I think one of the other elements that we've seen pretty consistently is, and this goes directly into some of the labor shortages that we're seeing today, is the expectations have just risen, right? When you're hiring Gen Z, you're hiring millennials, they're wanting to be proud of the companies that they work for, right? And all of a sudden, they're not going to work for a company that doesn't take this stuff seriously. That wasn't the case 5 years ago necessarily, but all of a sudden, they've got some of that power to be able to choose. They've got the ability to go to companies and be attracted to companies that are taking this stuff very seriously. A few years ago, I'm curious if you guys saw this as well, felt like companies were talking about it, but now they're actually being forced to walk the walk.
Yeah, and even, a step further than that, we're representing a client who their employees have been, talking to regulators and the press about the company not standing behind its public statements and promises. I think it's important that employee engagement be part of the core strategy, especially if you look at this new generation. I'm loath to use the term millennials, but there is a new sort of awareness and activism that's at an individual level where employees don't accept, inconsistency from employers. And I think companies that don't understand, we need to be explaining what we do and why we do it, how we're engaging, doing these things the right way, listening to employees about what's important to them, what causes they care about, how they want to position. Failure to do that, causes real problems. And, today you're looking at Facebook with a whistleblower who is, very much, disrupting that company on her own. And again, it used to be a whistleblower emerged once in a while. Now you've got to worry about, your whole employee base, motivating on these things.
Transparency is terrible.
But they're good people. They're just not practicing.
Yeah, and it's funny what you said about millennials, because I don't think they like using the term millennial either. They always say, I'm not one of them, even though I fit into the category. I'm not like them.
Sure.
But the transparency piece is interesting, and we go back to the governance piece, and you've got to get all the laws followed, of course, and you've got to behave properly around legal issues. The social piece you're saying is taken center stage, and I agree with you on that. It's funny. We've got a client who is incredibly good at the S, the social piece. In California, they failed to put their employee numbers on the pay stubs in the right place, and there was a class action lawsuit, and they had to pay $250,000 as a company that pays really, really well and takes very good care of their employees. They missed a governance piece that we would all say is very small. It was on there, it was just in the wrong location, and California punished them badly for this. You're not safe from any of the three initials, really, even if you're a great company.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting that, you're fortunate to know some companies that are doing the S pretty well, because I think a lot are struggling with the S. The environmental piece is one where, whether it's reducing your carbon footprint or there's a lot of practical and technical and strategic measures in place. The governance piece, either through regulation or through, best practices, you see companies adopting some risk protocols to sort of avoid unnecessary risk. But I think on the social piece, many of them are skirting the issue. They'll stick in, instead of social, sustainability, right?
Right. We followed the laws.
Right, exactly,
we followed the
right.
laws.
And I think the social piece is one where, because of some of the sensitivities around it, it causes some companies to really take a pause or to not try to actively deal with it and deal with it passively.
Yep.
And I think the ones that are being successful are the ones who are embracing that this is a part of our culture and we have to really address it. And when looking at the social piece, I think it's one where companies need to take that a little bit more seriously.
Yeah, and it's Dave and I talked about this in the last video, which is some of the best companies out there are firing their customers to protect their employees. Because for a long time we've minimized the complexity of the supply chain, and we said, no, we don't need warehouses to have inventory go up and down. We'll just make the people go up and down. It turns out people don't like going up and down. So forced overtime is a big issue, right? Destroying family lives. And it's a problem for a lot of companies, and that's a huge part of the S, is employees feeling abused, working 70, 80 hours a week, which, by the way, is in line with the laws of some states in our country, but it's not in line with the S, and social activism is really biting back here.
Yeah, and I think you hit something, Woody, that's worth picking up, which is the whole supply chain piece. When you're being evaluated on ESG, it's no longer what are you doing within the four walls of your business. It's what is your ecosystem? What does that look like? The supply chain, the way you're sourcing material, the labor practices elsewhere, and what they're doing on the environment. How are they, managing their social S? And the accountability piece is something as well that I just think companies aren't prepared to audit. They're not prepared to regulate or put policies in place at this point, and that's really crashing down on people's heads right now.
Yep, they want all the flexibility in the supply chain, and we have a lot of examples of this. Global 10 companies
Right.
That want all the flexibility and low cost, but at the same time are saying your employees as a supplier to us can only work 55 hours a week. But I want 3 million cases by Tuesday. You have 3 days to accomplish that. And there's no way to do it except to carry huge amounts of inventory, which is very expensive, and then I can't be competitive on cost. So there is a breaking point in there, and that's supply and demand. We don't have it figured out.
Right.
So Tom, I think you bring up an interesting point that 10 years ago, 20 years ago, it was enough to not be awful, right? And now all of a sudden, social expectations have risen by a lot. It feels like that is scaring a lot of CEOs today, who are very much unsure of what to do about it.
Yeah, I think what happened is society's been tired, especially in the United States, of the gridlock we've had in government. People don't see progress, but society keeps moving and progressing. And so, the levers that activism has picked up now is, look, let's go to the companies, the boards, let's buy shares, let's elect, boards of directors. The rules of engagement have changed. And again, the one thing I think I would say to companies is, there's a moment of opportunity to go partner with NGOs, with social interest groups, environmental groups, to see what's possible. There are going to be those that live on the extremes on both sides, but I think more than ever there's an opportunity to partner, to hear. One of the things that Shawn's taught me, and he can talk about this, is that companies typically have written checks and feel like they've covered themselves by doing that. Or they put in place these great programs, let's do Black community outreach, but they never engage the Black community to say, what should we do? How would you design this? What do you want? Where should the resources go? Yeah. And I think, the more companies are smart about doing that, and Shawn's working on this in his business, the better their marks are going to be. A lot of frustration is we're doing all this stuff, we're pouring money into these things, and we're getting no credit for it. We're not getting recognition. And I think it's because it's misaimed or they're misexecuted because they're just missing the two-way street on this.
They don't think it's a strategy; they think it's a charity. And we've talked about this in the past. Is if you think it's a charity activity, you don't understand ESG at all.
Right. It's not philanthropy; it's business.
Absolutely, and it's also, some of the fundamental aspects of what this is actually engaging and forming relationships. So first and foremost, are you engaging your employees, and do you have a relationship with them on these type of issues where you can actually get their perspective? And to a certain extent, management feels like they do, but they don't really sometimes actively engage. And so when these social issues come up, one of the things that you should be doing is, well, how do your employees feel about this? What do they think about that? When the murder of George Floyd happened and the protests surrounding that, many companies became awakened to that this is a real issue, despite the fact that it's been happening for some time, and decided to say Black Lives Matter. But did you talk to your Black employees before you said that? Or did you engage the Black community before you said that? Not that it's not the right thing to say, but saying that is one thing. Now, what does that mean for your organization?
Right.
And so a lot of times there's a quick response, but not a real engagement about what this means and how do you, live up to that going forward.
But we hung a banner out in front of the building that said Black Lives Matter. Isn't that enough, Shawn?
No, it's not enough because clearly these issues continue to exist.
Yes.
And if you're talking about an issue like police reform, many companies say, what can I do about that, right? Well, there's a real dialogue about what you can do. One of those things is you can actually understand the issue and try to support efforts to address the issue. But many companies obviously didn't really feel that that was a space that they could operate in. And then there's so many other issues like that. I mean, I think it starts with, not even starts, but you go back 18 months, COVID happened. And the real thing is, well, how did you treat your employees during this period of time? How did you treat your customers during this period of time? And then all of these other issues started to come about, whether it be, the protests, the social unrest, whether it be, the violence against Asian Americans in this country, whether the voting rights issues in the states, the Capitol, riots on January 6th. Now, all of a sudden, there are many of these issues happening, and your employees and your customers are looking for leadership. And when they don't see the leadership that they want with their policymakers, they're going to look to business leaders to get involved because of the economic power that the businesses have. But also, this is a place where they spend a lot of their time because this is where they work.
You're painting kind of a scary picture of what happens when you're not prepared and don't understand kind of your ESG health. And so, I mean, there's a lot of CEOs that we all talk to and boards that say, I think we're covered because we wrote a check. And, I think I'd love to hear from you guys, all three of you, and Dave, I'd love to hear from you about what happens when you don't have a plan in place. This is a problem. And we know the crisis. We know what happens.
Yeah, I think first and foremost, one thing companies have to come to terms with is you can no longer say we're doing the right thing, take our word for it. You have to have validators. You have to have relationships with third parties who say, this company does what they say they're doing. This company is having impact. We work with these people, to achieve our common goals. And so it starts with just having relationships. It's too late when Color of Change calls for a boycott because of your policies in the Black community to go create a relationship with Color of Change. Engagement, is something that takes time. Being an old lobbyist, I used to say I try to do 10 meetings with a legislator or a staffer before I ask for something. Mm-hmm. Do we take that same, discipline and approach to, these sort of relationships? The other thing that I think is important is that there's been a sea change in, the face of activism. Shawn can tell you, the Jesse Jackson, Al Sharpton groups, they still exist, but there's a whole new generation that is, different terms of engagement, more maybe impatience with the way things are, different tactics, and I think companies tend to get comfortable that they've had an advisory board, they've got senior diverse officials from companies around the world that obviously inform a point of view, but they really aren't connected to the grassroots level of what's happening, and I think all of that is kind of what you're talking about. If you're not starting to understand that first, engage, kind of map, pick some places to create relationships, you're going to have a hard time, with validation if that's all you need. But certainly, if you get into a crisis or a reputational problem, you're going to be at a deficit.
And Tom, I think that engagement goes a step further, which is not just developing the relationships, but it really is very simply engaging these organizations as to what can I do to help, right? And yes, financial support is a big help, but there's a lot of ingenuity, sophistication, and strategies that corporate and business leaders have that could really benefit these organizations, that if they invested some time and resources behind, could go a long way to helping these organizations address some of the challenges in society. And I think if companies show up in that way, they develop a more authentic relationship. And to Tom's point, when issues come your way as an organization about what you're doing in the community, you will actually have community leaders that will vouch for you as a good company. They may not agree with the issue or stance that you're taking, but they can actually say, this organization is doing this great work and we're working with them. But it really is about approaching these organizations as to how I can help in a sincere and authentic way. And it does require some investment over time, It can really bear fruit if you really take it seriously and authentically.
Organizations are generally terrible at communication, though. And that's, you're talking about communication, they're terrible
Yes.
at it. We survey employees globally, and we found that 33% of employees feel like the management team communicates well with them. And when we talk to management teams, they say, we do huddles every day, and we've got a town hall once a month. And that's basically talking at the employees. You're not listening to what they say. There's not a two-way communication. We tell them what we want them to hear. They say lots of stuff. The employees say, they say lots of stuff, but it's nothing that I care about. And so that's not great communication. They're good at issuing memos.
That's where I think that this concept of the double bottom line is just going to be one that gains more and more steam over the next few years. We found pretty early on that just doing the governance piece or just doing one of these elements is not nearly enough. That's kind of checking the box, the bare minimum. You've got to have a much more comprehensive look at it, and that's where I think as companies figure out how to measure their ESG bottom line, just like they're measuring their financial bottom line, we're going to start to get more of a tie between the two.
Yep.
So I think we've talked a lot about the problem.
Right.
So it all
We're good at that.
The easy part.
Begs the natural question of what on earth should companies do about it now? And so let's pick that up with the next session of No Suits, No Slides.